Welcome to the Explainer. Have you ever looked at the back of a cereal box to check the nutritional label? Usually right before deciding to just eat the whole box anyway? But it's there, giving you the exact grams of sugar, fiber, and protein. It's standardized, it's clear, and most importantly, it's legally binding. But what if we could do the exact same thing for corporate sustainability? What if, instead of vague marketing buzzwords on a carton of eggs or a package of bacon, there was a strict, standardized accounting system tracking the exact ethical and environmental impact of that food? Well, it turns out there actually is. And today, we're going to unpack exactly how it works.
It really all starts with this massive, honestly kind of mind-bending question. How do you measure animal welfare on an industrial scale? When a giant food and beverage corporation produces literally millions of tons of meat and dairy, how do investors, regulators, and consumers actually know what goes on inside those barns? Today, we are taking a fascinating micro to macro journey. We're going to start by looking at how the living conditions of a single animal are tracked, and then we're going to zoom all the way out to see how global climate change and water stress threaten the entire supply chain.
Okay, let's dive into this. The framework we're looking at today comes directly from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB. Specifically, we're looking at their latest standard for the meat, poultry, and dairy industry. This right here is the concrete solution that cuts through all that greenwashing. These standards require companies to report on their sustainability risks with the exact same rigor that they use to report their financial revenues. It forces corporations to turn qualitative, kind of fuzzy ideas, like treating animals well or protecting the environment, into cold, hard, quantitative data.
Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with standardizing meat and dairy, move to tracking animal welfare, look at crate and cage-free metrics, cover supply chain vulnerabilities, and finally wrap up with water stress and feed.
Right, let's jump straight into Section 1, standardizing meat and dairy. Because to understand the accounting, we first have to understand the industry itself.
The SASB baseline reveals a massive, incredibly complex footprint. These companies produce raw and processed animal products for both human and animal consumption. But the absolutely crucial point here is the structure. The largest entities out there have international operations that are highly vertically integrated. However, they rely heavily on contract or independent farmers to actually supply the animals. This creates a really fascinating tension. Think about it. A massive global brand is ultimately responsible for the practices of thousands of independent farmers down the line. If an independent contractor makes a mistake, it's the global brand that ends up on the front page of the news.
Which brings us perfectly to our second section, tracking animal welfare. We are now zooming right in on the animals themselves. The SASB industry standard is remarkably blunt here. It says, entities perceived to be causing unnecessary cruelty to animals may face increased risk of fines, damage to brand reputation, and regulatory restrictions. This is a vital shift in perspective. For these corporations, animal welfare isn't just some moral or ethical debate. It is a massive financial risk. Pressure from consumers and advocacy groups can actually drive real shifts in industry practices. If a company is caught using unnecessarily restrictive enclosures, they might face mandated factory closures or just catastrophic damage to their brand. On the flip side, companies that adapt to these trends quickly, well, they can capture entirely new market share.
So how do we actually measure that risk? Let's move to Section 3 and look at the nuts and bolts, the specific crate and cage-free metrics.
To track something, you have to define it with absolute precision. The standards define a gestation crate as an enclosure for an individual breeding sow that is restrictive enough to prevent dynamic movements, such as turning around. It specifically notes they are typically non-bedded, with concrete floors and metal stalls. It's a stark, highly specific definition. By defining the physical space exactly like this, SASB leaves literally no room for corporate loopholes. You either use them or you don't.
Now contrast that stark reality with the standards definition of a cage-free environment for shell eggs. It's defined as a space that allows hens unrestricted access to food and water and provides freedom to roam within the space during the laying cycle. Again, highly specific. If a company claims to be cage-free, the auditors have exact, measurable parameters to check against.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these definitions translate into hard accounting codes. These aren't just PR statements, they're auditable metrics.
Under code FBMP410A.1, companies must disclose the exact percentage of pork produced without the use of gestation crates measured by weight. And for code FBMP410A.2, they must disclose the percentage of cage-free shell egg sales. By requiring companies to report these exact percentages year over year, investors and everyday consumers can see if a company is actually transitioning to more humane practices or if they're just talking about it.
But, of course, the health of an animal inside the barn isn't the only risk these companies face. Let's transition to Section 4, Supply Chain Vulnerabilities, and zoom out to the broader network.
Sustainability doesn't stop at the barn door. A company could have the most pristine, cage-free facilities in the world, but if their global supply chain collapses, well, the whole business collapses.
As we noted earlier, these massive entities rely heavily on a really complex web of contract farmers and suppliers, and there are deep, hidden vulnerabilities in that network. Companies have to manage risks related to deforestation, how land is used, and how waste is managed. They have to control massive water withdrawals. Ultimately, a company's financial health is directly tied to its ability to secure a steady source of animals at desired price points. If they fail to manage the environmental and social impacts in their supply chain, it leads to supply disruptions, higher costs of capital, and constrained revenue growth.
Which brings us to our final section, and arguably the most critical macro-level threat of them all: water stress and feed. When we think of water use in agriculture, we usually picture the animals drinking it, right? Actually, scratch that. The real water footprint is in the feed. SASB defines animal feed as including soybean meal, cornmeal, other grains, and fodder provided to livestock. Cultivating these millions of tons of feed requires just astronomical amounts of water. If the regions growing this feed run dry, the entire meat and dairy industry grinds to a halt. So, the standard requires companies to track where their feed comes from using a very specific threshold, greater than 80%. This number comes from the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct tool. If a region has a baseline water stress of over 80%, it's classified as extremely high. Under metric FBMP44A.1, companies must disclose the exact percentage of their animal feed by weight that's sourced from these highly stressed, risky regions. It is a brilliant way to quantify a company's exposure to drought and resource scarcity. And this brilliantly illustrates how companies are forced to actively prepare for the future. The standards require a deep discussion of their strategy to manage these climate change risks. This means utilizing insurance policies, investing in hedging instruments to protect against wild price volatility, diversifying their supply chain so they aren't reliant on a single region, and even actively investing in ecosystem and biodiversity management. They literally have to plan for extreme weather events, shifts in rangeland quality, and disease migration. It shows that climate change isn't just some distant abstract concept. It's an immediate, day-to-day operational challenge that requires serious strategic financial planning.
We've gone from the space inside a single gestation crate all the way out to the global risk of water scarcity. It's a remarkable interconnected system of accountability. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. Next time you buy groceries, which metrics are hiding behind the label? When you pick up that carton of eggs or that package of meat, remember that behind the farm imagery and the marketing slogans, there's an entire world of standardized, weight-based percentages tracking exactly how that food was brought to market. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions about where your food comes from.